the war's immediate aftermath. The objective of this module is to understand what was the post-war environment like. And, in the wake of the war ending, how is our perception living in Canada in the 21st century about World War II different from the way that survivors looked at the world? One of the documentaries that I have listed as a supplemental source is from the World at War series, an old 1970s era BBC production dealing with World War II. I think what makes it useful still today is that it was closer to events and that many important people that had experienced the war were alive, and they are interviewed and they can give their impression of the war. So The Reckoning is really the last episode of that series, and it really deals with the horrible the horrible consequences that survivors faced. So one of the first few images of the documentary is footage about Germans, often women, going back to Allied lines after being captured, in many cases obviously raped by Russian troops, as well as the ashes of many cities. So what that footage kind of does is to, put us there on the stage in May 1945. The war is over, but the world is so broken. And I think what's useful about that footage is it kind of calibrates our perspective, because in modern Canada, we kind of tend to remember World War II as a good war. Canadian boys went out and, obviously some of them went into combat, but they were fighting for, Western civilization. They were fighting against the evils of Nazism. They ended the Holocaust. So this seems to justify the war. Of course, one of the things that's really missing, especially being really 5 generations removed from the war, is understanding how horrific the experience was and how these horrors were internalized in various ways by survivors. So, where I think this documentary is most useful is to help us to get into the mindset of survivors and how they looked at their world. So one of the things that's very important to understand too about 1945 is World War II being a global conflict, how the devastation and suffering was so widely distributed across the globe. It wasn't just the soldiers in the trenches that had suffered. The civilians had been the prototypical casualty. Total war had transformed essentially cities of life into ash. So in those German cities, you can see in the Reckoning video, women are coming through in brick brigades and really just taking and hauling away the rubble. The cities are going to have to be built up from scratch. Many cities like Tokyo, Gdansk, even Manila had seen significant damage. Many cases, 80 to 90% of the housing stock disappeared. So there was going to be no return to normal. And the effects of the war lasted for many months, even years behind. We often forget that in Vietnam, 1 million people died of starvation after World War II, largely because of infrastructure losses, sunk shipping that prevented rice from being harvested and brought into certain areas. And the fighting didn't really stop in all areas. Yes, the Axis and Allies, they had signed peace treaties, but this only set the stage for other conflicts in Eastern Europe. A lot of ethnic violence inspired by the Soviet Union. In Asia as well, there was violence, retaliation against Japanese settlers. China broke out into a civil war when the nationalists in China couldn't agree on a formula for a coalition government. For the Dutch in Indonesia, when the Japanese surrendered, they originally went back into their homes, but then they were greeted by the Pemuda, essentially the militia that the Japanese had established among the Indonesians that didn't want the Dutch back. The Pemuda often attacked the Dutch settlers. In fact, they felt so insecure, they in many cases went back to the Japanese prison camps and asked the Japanese to protect them, if you can imagine that. What about the Jews who had survived the Holocaust? People like Otto Frank, it took him 6 weeks to figure out that his whole family was killed. Many Jews, even 2 years later, were in displaced persons camps in Germany, unable to go home, or in some cases facing pogroms and ethnic violence in places like Poland. So, World War II had created tremendous disruption. The amount of displaced people in Eastern Europe was over 8 million people. Many of them were Germans, but not only Germans. For many of the Axis powers, they were now occupied by the Allies and faced a very uncertain future. So when we kind of put this into perspective, we can see that World War II was this global wave of destruction, and so much damage and suffering had been caused. There was no immediate formula for repairing all this damage. It was going to be a long, tough slog. We also have to kind of put ourselves in the minds of survivors and how they looked at the world. They might have celebrated, the end of the war, because at least the formal hostilities is over. But on the other hand, the suffering would linger on. So we have this term, in psychology, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And, this is important to understand because civilians had been so often in World War II, been not only in the front lines or caught in the crossfire of armies, sometimes they had been specifically targeted for abuse, ritual humiliation, or even genocide. So I recount in the textbook the story of one of the survivors of Buchenwald and how he went to the cynical Nazi inscription Arbeit macht frei and had written down never again. And to me, that slogan, that idea, is something of the spirit that was shared by so many survivors after 1945. They had suffered horribly, first during the Great Depression, then it had intensified in World War II. And it seemed that, for survivors, the only thing that they knew for sure is that this could never happen again. This was a catastrophe. And the world that was broken needed to be fixed, and this needed to put to right. So if you think about the language of the Atlantic Charter and the idea of the scourge of war, the idea that ordinary people should never have to go through this suffering and trauma again, this was in a way the universal spirit that spread across the global surface. Now again, the most industrial areas of the world, Europe, Asia as well, these areas have been devastated by total war, bombing, submarine warfare. So those needed to be rebuilt, and there was no easy formula for that, especially from states that had gone very high into debt to finance the war. Once again, you had the German question. Versailles hadn't worked. Now you had to come up with another formula to somehow put it to right, to reestablish the balance of power in Europe, to build a durable peace. So these were questions where, unlike 1919, when Woodrow Wilson came with the League of Nations idea, there were no great ideas about there. It just seemed that they hadn't fixed it the first time. Why would they be able to fix it the second time? Unlike World War I, the losers had been completely destroyed and were being occupied. And this would be, both a challenge for political transition. How would they be rehabilitated? In the Nazi case, denazified. In the Japanese case, their country democratized. So I call this the occupation problem. This was, again, untested formula. How are we going to rehabilitate our enemies? Make them pay for the damage they did, make them atone for the evil acts that they did, but also somehow rehabilitate them so they'll be partners in the post-war order. Then there was all the problems in the colonies. Many of these areas have been promised freedom. Other areas have been extensively exploited or damaged by the war. They are already dissatisfied with colonialism. They are immediately demanding their freedom at the same time that the colonial powers wanted to use their labor and resources for their own rebuilding. So there was just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unrest, dissatisfaction that was baked into the cake, so that people could be glad the war was over, but it just seemed that the future ahead was very dark and grim. So if we look at survivors and what was their mindset in the 4 years after World War II, they were survivors of catastrophe. And in a way they were dealing with a baggage, not only the trauma of war in many cases, but also the feeling that this war was completely unnecessary. And the Western states had done a lot to try to appease the Axis, and this hadn't worked. There was the horrors of the Holocaust. I mean, it was generally understood during the war that Hitler hated Jews, and he was discriminated against them and made them suffer. But it was another thing to understand the scale of this and the depravity of it. So one of the things that Eisenhower had done at Buchenwald is bring the cameras in, and Canadians kind of saw just these mounds of bodies, and it kind of made it concrete, the evil of what would happen. And it raised fundamental questions about the nature of humanity, the nature of Western civilization, whether it was a module to be emulated. The atom bomb seemed to inaugurate a new age in which humanity could destroy itself. So there was just a lot of darkness and pessimism in the immediate post-war era. People were exhausted as well from total war, whether you had been in combat and did these tours of duty, or you were a civilian, just been working on adrenaline, long hours. People just wanted to turn the page, but it seemed difficult to do it. The economy was broken, the supply lanes disrupted, industrial plants were broken, need to be transitioned back to civilian economy, consumer goods. Hundreds of millions of civilians had really suffered combat wounds, and the wounds of the war would not, you couldn't just turn the page on that. A lot of them became alcoholics. This became kind of the cheap man's antidepressant, a way of coping with the unresolved trauma of this conflict. So when you look at this and understand the psychological profile of survivors, you can kind of understand the mindset and how they looked at the process of rebuilding. Generally speaking, societies are relatively conservative. They're not very innovative. But every once in a while, something like World War II comes around and makes such a mess of things that people demand a change. And just the very way that World War II was fought, where the leaders were trying to mobilize people around this broader idea of a crusade for freedom, asking everyone to sacrifice for a common cause. This kind of made the war a people's war. The idea is that citizens would sacrifice again, but they wanted to have a larger stake into a better future. The fact that survivors had seen many of their friends die, they were exhausted, they were dissatisfied with capitalism and mistrustful of markets relative to the Great Depression, unsatisfied with democracy that had not really dealt with the Depression, hadn't prevented the war, that had been a appeaser. This created a scenario where people were willing to get to the mindset of extraordinary change. And they were willing to think about, fundamental changes to the international system, the state, and the family. And the way that the Western leaders, particularly Roosevelt and Churchill, had invoked these ideas of a better future, peace and prosperity after war, had mobilized people And the idea that now the statesmen would have to deliver, and they would have to create a better world, and at least guarantee that in this new world there would be less inequality, less racial injustice. No longer could, brutal dictators like Hitler run amok and challenge collective security. So there was a lot of pressure on leaders, statesmen, national politicians, parties, to kind of meet on this implicit demand of survivors for a better world. So what I'm going to do in the last module is kind of look at how these various fears, concerns, anxieties, dreams, demands, in a way crystallized and were concretized in what I call the Atlantic Blueprint. Kind of these grand principles first articulated in the Atlantic Charter, a kind of Magna Carta type document, and how they were implemented at the international, national, local level in various ways to meet these unsatisfied demands of post-war survivors.